Children can be dismissed for children's church. Join me in Timothy, 2 Timothy again. 1 and 2 Timothy and Titus are called pastoral epistles. They were inspired by the Holy Spirit and instructions to Timothy, the pastor of the church of Ephesus, and Titus, the pastor of the church of Crete. Therefore, I take them very seriously. As a young man, I memorized those passages when I realized God was committing me or calling me to such a, I was going to say horrible. That's not the right word. Awesome responsibility. 2 Timothy chapter 1, Paul reminds Timothy of the importance of faithfulness and not being ashamed of God in a world that's rapidly changing. Chapter 2, he tells him of the need of grace and recognizing the job's bigger than you are. Remember, grace is God's influence, God working in us so that he can work through us. Be strong in that grace, he says. And he also tells him that he has a responsibility. He can't do it alone. I'm often reminded regularly of the fact that if other people aren't touched by God and roll up their sleeves and get involved, whether it's the children's ministry, the nursery, the little church, the junior church, the video ministry, the music ministry, or the nursing home ministry. We have the nursing home next Sunday. The young people's ministry, the youth ministry. If God's people don't recognize God's grace at work in their heart and roll up their sleeves and say, what can I do? Job's too big for me. No way I can do it alone. But see, it's not about me, it's about God. God working in his people. So he said, the things that you've learned, pass on to other faithful men and women who can respond to God's grace and then pass that grace on to others and teach others also. But it's going to be hard. Endure hardness is a good soldier of Jesus Christ. Very next verse says, no man that wars entangles himself with the affairs of this life, that it may please him who's chosen to be a soldier. The rest of the chapter talks about the tendency to get tangled. And then pick up reading with me in verse 24. The servant of the Lord must not strive. There's a battle, all right, but you need to fight the right battle. Be patient with all men. Be gentle, able to teach them, patient, in meekness, instructing those that oppose themselves, if God peradventure will give them repentance to the acknowledging of the truth, that they may recover themselves out of the snare of the devil, who are taken captive by him. As I've been reflecting and praying and watching in our culture the attack on particularly masculinity, I realize we're in a culture that's captured. People have lost respect for masculinity. Our politicians have called it a disease. So that's why I've been spending so much time. The message is applicable to anybody in a position of influence, so don't check out on me, ladies. The very next chapter, chapter 3, basically says this no. Remember, chapter 2 is step up, men. Be strong in the grace of God. Be willing to endure hardness. Don't get tangled up in the things of this world, because you're going to end up in the snare of the devil. And this is because this know also that in the last days perilous times will come, and men will be lovers of their own selves, covetous, boasters, proud, disobedient to parents, blasphemers, unthankful, unholy, truce breakers, without natural affections. These are these days he's describing. So if we're not faithful like in chapter 1 and develop the strength in God's grace in chapter 2, we will become absorbed in the society of chapter 3. So we've been focusing on these last couple of months. How can we get equipped? How can we become faithful men and women who are teachable and able to teach, not just our immediate family, but those people in our lives? And I use the acronym POINT MEN, and these are the things you guys gave me. I asked you to pray. These are what you gave me. Prayerful, observant, inspiring, has nerve or courage, and noble in character, trustworthy. Last week we talked about mentor, a trusted guide, someone who can walk alongside of another to help encourage them. And honestly, I was overwhelmed by the response. I asked people who felt that they would benefit from a spiritual trusted guide to slip up their hands, and many of you did. I didn't notice all of them. I don't know who it was, to be honest with you. And I said, how many of you would be willing to walk alongside of others? And many other hands went up. I sent out an email last night. If you didn't get it, get me out of your junk box. But I want you to pray about that, because this is critical. There are people out here that God's Spirit is working on, right? It's God that works in you so that God can work through you. And I want to become more effective as a church. We can't force it. God's army is all volunteer. But matching people with others that can encourage them. This morning I want to talk to you about the A in the man. And this word was given to me by almost everyone that responded. Most of them women. What do you need in a point man that you can follow? I need someone who's available. Someone who's available. Ezekiel chapter 22, God says, if you read Ezekiel 22, it reads very much like 2 Timothy 3. The priests are corrupt, the politicians are corrupt and taking bribes, the people are drifting from God towards idols. And God says, and I sought for a man among them that would make up the hedge, stand in the gap before me in the land, that I should not destroy it, and I found none. What God is really saying is nobody was available. Nobody was available. They were all preoccupied with other things. Remember, Jesus described the gospel in the Matthew 13 parable of the sower and the seed, and some fell on hard soil, the path, and the birds of the air, the devil snatched it away before they could understand it. Some fell among stony ground where there wasn't any depth, rocks just below the surface. And it sprung up quickly enough, but there was no depth, and it withered. And some fell among thorns, and the thorns and the weeds choked it before it could ever grow. And that's the world in which we live. And that's why Jesus said the thorns are the cares of this world, the deceitfulness of riches, the lust of other things entering, and it just crowds God's will and God's word out of our lives. That's where we live. We live in a thorny world. And today, just as surely as 3,000 years ago in Ezekiel's day, or 2,800 years ago in Ezekiel's day, God is still looking for men, and most of us are preoccupied. We're just busy with things that we think are important, but what could be more important than eternity? And leading our families particularly, and the friends that we claim to love, in a relationship that's going to be not just in this world satisfying, but obviously in heaven. Someone has wisely said the greatest ability is really availability. Doesn't matter how gifted you are if you're not available. Doesn't matter how wise you are, dads or moms, if you just don't have time to impart that wisdom onto your children or to your family or friends. Bible tells us in 1 Corinthians 13, though I speak with the tongues of men and of angels, have not charity, I'm just a bunch of noise. Though I bestow all my goods to feed the poor, I give everything away, but it's not motivated with charity, it's not worth anything. Though I even give my body to be burned, I'm willing to die for Jesus, but it's not motivated by love. It's profitless. Then goes on to describe this magnificent word charity. And it closes with this verse, now I abide faith, hope, and charity. These three things. But the greatest of these is charity. Why? Because charity is agape, and it basically is God's love working in us to love the people around us, even when they're not lovely. And it literally means a feast of benevolence. Benevolence, giving. I am willing to sacrifice to give what is needed. Someone wrote, I think Andre Crouch wrote a song many decades ago. Amazing grace has always been my song of praise, for it was grace that bought my liberty. And the one phrase in that I've never forgotten, he looked beyond my fault and saw my need. That's what love does. And men, if we love our families and if we love our friends, that we need to allow God's love, first of all, into our life to influence us and then working through our lives. But we've got to be available to Him for Him to do that. When or if the leader, the father, the mother, the husband, the wife, and I don't mean that wife are to lead their husbands, I just mean we all have influence. What happens if we're unavailable? I'm not going to embarrass you by asking you to give us a show of hands, but my folks were unavailable. My dad checked out when I was 5. My mom checked out into alcohol. And Never had a birthday. Only one birthday party. And I'm not moaning. I'm simply being very vulnerable. One birthday party. Birthdays were not a big thing in my family because no one was there. My mom handed me $10 at my 13th birthday and said, go take your friends to a bowling alley. I can remember in my 10th birthday, a very tender moment between me and my mom. I came home from school. She happened to be home that day. She touched my cheek and she said, I thought about you today. And I still remember this now. My mom did the best she could. I'm not trying to criticize her. But I grew up with emotionally unavailable parents, and so did some of you. And you know, I didn't know any better because it was my life. Probably about 20 years ago, Linda and I were invited to a conference for pastors and their wives and counselors, and Dr. David Ferguson had written a book called The Pursuit of Intimacy, and he was going to test it on us. So he paid our way to the Mark Hotel in Winston-Salem, and we spent a couple of days processing, working through this. And one of the assignments dealt with this issue. I was a pastor and I was a counselor, and I'm not, to make a long story short, it was a list of a number of words in alphabetical order, and one was available. Available. And he said, I want you to look at these words, and I want you to think about your parents, and think about your dad first, and if your dad was available to you, I want you to put a little half circle on the left side and go all available, approval, appreciated, affirming, and all of these different words. And I remember going through that. I was 30 years old, 35, 36 years old at the time. And then said, now do that, and then think of your mom and your relationship with your mom. And then if you felt your mom was available to you, then put a semicircle around the other one. So if dad and mom were available, you circle that word. You with me so far? I did that. I aced that test. That was easy. And I finished in a few moments. And I remember looking around. Everybody else is still real busy, and I'm bored. David walks over to me and said, what's wrong? I said, nothing's wrong. I didn't get any of this stuff. I'll never forget his words. He looked at Linda and said, you poor thing. You poor thing. And I'm thinking, what? I'm okay. Can anyone here associate at any level with that? If we grow up in an environment where these types of things are not passed on to us, we don't know how to pass them on to somebody else. And but for the grace of God and mentors in my life, when I came to Christ as a teenager, if I didn't have 3 men adopt me and teach me what a Christian man was, then it really would be poor Linda. There's a predictable, you can Google this, there's all kinds of lists, but there's a predictable effect if your leader, the point men and point women in your life are just not available. One, you fear abandonment. You got some abandonment issues. You have attachment and intimacy issues. You don't really know how to commit yourself because no one has ever committed themselves to you when you were young. This is a real powerful one. You tend to crave particularly masculine attention and approval. What does that look like in the life of a teenage girl? Sometimes it doesn't look nice. You assume it's your fault when something goes wrong. You just assume, what did I do wrong? What's that?
That's because I am.
You assume blame. David and my background are very similar. You cling to relationships once you latch onto them, even the unhealthy ones, because you fear you'll never get another one. So it's very hard to let go of an unhealthy relationship. And you overcompensate. Any perfectionists here? Any workaholics here? I don't know, and I'm not preaching psychology. I'm talking about consequences. If we don't take this principle of being available seriously. In order to be available, I've come up with, and you help me, 3 things that help us to become more available. One is become aware. The dictionary defines aware as concerned and informed, well informed. You know, you're concerned enough to learn what's going on. Proverbs 27 says, "Be thou diligent to know the state of thy flocks and look well to thy herds." He's talking about shepherding your family. Know what's going on in your flock, because the reality is, men, you are the shepherd of your family. You are the shepherd. You're supposed to lead them. You're supposed to make sure they're getting fed relationally, emotionally, spiritually, and you're supposed to protect them. So God says, know what's going on in their lives. Hebrews 13:17, this is talking about the pastor of a church, but pastor is a shepherd and your shepherds are your family. It says, obey them that have the rule over you and submit yourselves because they're supposed to be watching for your souls as they that must give account. And dads, you will stand before God and give account for your family and how you responded to them. So what should we become aware of? Well, their strengths and their struggles. They have both, and so do you. To ignore their strengths means to help them to grow up without the awareness that they have strengths. And also it robs you of the benefit of their strengths. To ignore their struggles. Do you notice that teenagers tend to get moody? And when they get moody, where do they go? They disappear into their room. They shut the door. They disappear into some world. And some of us have learned the hard way that if we don't occasionally walk into that room and figure out what they're struggling with, we may lose them. Lose them physically, lose them emotionally, lose them relationally. Strengths and struggles. Jesus said, I am the good shepherd, and I know my sheep. Now, my family's here, and every time I preach about family, I'm convicted because they know I'm not perfect, and I'm not here to present myself as the perfect father. I'm a work in progress as well. But Jesus said, the good shepherd knows the sheep. Do you know what's going on in your family's life? We should be aware not just of their strengths and struggles, but the dangers and the detours. Remember, we talked in 2 Timothy, God talked in 2 Timothy chapter 2 that Satan has snares. He lays snares, and people get stuck in the snares. And they stay stuck in the snares until they recognize and repent, and God frees them. 1 Peter 5:8, written to pastors, Peter says, I'm an elder, I'm a bishop, feed the flock of God which is over you, taking the oversight, not of constraint or filthy lucre, but being examples to the flock. When the chief shepherd will appear, you'll get the reward. It's talking about pastors, but the principle is shepherds. Principle is people who are leading other people. Then it says, submit yourselves one to another, submit yourselves under the mighty hand of God. It says, Benedict says, verse 8, be sober and be vigilant, because your adversary, the devil, as a roaring lion, walketh about, seeking whom he may devour. Lions don't go after the leader in the sense of hunting an animal. They don't go after the alpha male, an ox or water buffalo. They don't go after the biggest gazelle. Who do they go after? The young, the weak, the struggling. So we got to understand the dangers and the detours of the family. And God says, whom steadfastly resist in the faith. James Dobson, who founded Focus on the Family probably 30 years ago, recently wrote, as I write, there is not a single example of a healthy family depicted in a sitcom that focuses on a masculine heterosexual guy who loves his kids and respected by his wife. Not one. I don't watch a lot of TV. I don't have cable. There's a movie, I may get it wrong, Last Man Standing. Anyone know that movie? Did they really cancel that movie? I heard they canceled it, and one of the reasons is because the man he's funny and whatever. I've watched it a couple of times on vacation. I can't remember the actor. Same guy who did Home Improvement, whoever that is. But the networks canceled him in spite of the fact that it was one of the most popular shows on TV. Do you know why they canceled it? Because he was politically incorrect. And I don't know if James wrote this before or after that. And I don't watch a lot of TV, so I can't validate. But I know this much: I've never seen a whole scene or episode of Family Guy, the Family Guy's not a Family Guy. There's not much in our culture that men can say, that's what I want to be. But Jesus models being aware. He says, I'm the good shepherd, I know my sheep, and by the way, I am known of mine. We've all made mistakes, and you know, when I start talking about my past around my kids, my wife kind of tenses up. She said, maybe you shouldn't be so honest about your past when I was a child. But maybe we should be more honest with our kids, especially as they get older, about the mistakes we made, about the struggles we've had. Jesus said, my sheep, I know my sheep, and they know me. Now, we're not Jesus and we're not flawless. But then he says, and I lay down my life for the sheep. It was Jesus who said, no greater love hath any man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends. Now, here's my point. Men, if necessary, would you be willing to lay down your life for your family? I can't answer that question for you. But I believe many of you would be. If it came to it, you would step in, you would take a bullet. You would do what it was necessary to save your wife, protect your wife, your children. And you know, I think many, I don't know that I say all, many men would do that, but here's the rub. If you really would be willing to do that, why is it so unreasonable for you to occasionally sacrifice a little time and attention? Rearrange your priorities a little bit so that you can enter into their world and be available to them. I don't know if you can see this, and I know this is terribly politically incorrect. Can you remember a day in our society where that was the attitude of men and brothers? I'll read the signs to you. By his grace, photography, the boy on your left, mess with her, the boy on the right, you go through us. Can you associate with that? Men and brothers who had the attitude that says, we are here to protect the women in our life. That attitude is rapidly changing in our society. For one reason, because we don't even know who the women in our lives are anymore. We're so confused. We need to be available to be aware. We need to be available to really appreciate. And the dictionary definition of appreciate is recognize the full worth or value of. And men, especially point men who are taking bullets and dodging problems and looking out for snares, we can be so busy providing for our family or protecting our family that we don't really recognize or aware or appreciate that they're following us. Appreciate the value or full worth. Paul modeled this so well. He often affirmed, as you read the New Testament, Apostle Paul was the human instrument of half of it. He would often name names of people who had made a difference in his life. For the corporate value, the value to the church and the cause of Christ, you know the house of Stephanus, he says in 1 Corinthians 16, they have addicted themselves to the ministry of the saints. We don't normally think of addiction as a good thing, do we? But the word addicted here is the word tasso. They have arranged their lives. They have prioritized their lives around God's business. That's what this really means. See, an addict prioritizes what? Their addiction. If it's porn, if it's drugs, if it's alcohol, they arrange their lives to make sure that that's an important part of it. Stephanus and his family, he had influenced his family so that they prioritized the ministry of the saints. Some of you may recognize that tasso. Submit means hupotasso. It's been called the hupotasso lasso. But what does it really mean? Hupo is under, tasso is arranged. When it says, wives, submit yourselves to your own husband, it doesn't mean get addicted to your husband. It means rearrange and prioritize your life to help him because he has an awesome responsibility that he's not up to. And unless you're coming along beside him, being the helpmate that God created you to be, your children are going to suffer. He praised people not just for what they did for others, but their personal value to him. The same passage. This would be Stephanus' household. They've refreshed my spirit. and they've refreshed yours as well. Therefore, acknowledge them that are a son. Here's the point. Has God brought people into your life that have refreshed your spirit? You know, the easier way to answer that question is, are there people in your life that aren't very refreshing? That you walk away from an encounter and you just feel puked on emotionally? Don't be that people. Be aware. Be people who appreciate. Yeah, most of us walk around with something that is not honorable in our lives, and I'm not saying we should ignore that, but the reality is there's honorable things. 2 Timothy chapter 2, in a great house there's vessels of honor and vessels unto dishonor. If a man would purge himself of these, the things that are dishonorable, he or she would be a vessel of an honor, sanctified, met for the master's use, and prepared for every good work. Let's not fail to recognize what's right in our families. You know, the thing about criticism, I didn't think about how to illustrate this, but let's say for a moment these are my expectations. My children, my wife, my friends. And this is the reality. My focus, naturally, the focus of my flesh is on what? On this space or on this space? Which one? This one? Normally, I know what I want. I know what I got. I want more than I got. So if my focus is on this, will I be appreciative or will I be critical? I'm not saying this isn't real and we shouldn't deal with it. But here's the point. If it used to be this and now it's this, I can at least appreciate this difference, yes? And if I get underneath, for lack of a better term, with appreciation and recognize what's right, it gives them the ability to go higher. If, on the other hand, my attitude is always here and reminding them of what's wrong, what impact is this going to have on them? It's going to push them down. The point man might be the leader, but he's very limited. He can't see or do everything. We're talking about appreciate not just their value, but appreciating the perspective of the people following us, right? We only got two eyes, and honestly, they can't look at two things. They can't focus on two things. The military term, I got your back, means what? What does this mean? Keep your eyes open. The point is, the team that's following the point man has a different perspective than the point man, and if we don't appreciate their perspective, they may see a snare we miss, and we end up walking into. We need each other. 1 Corinthians chapter 12 is all about the church being a body and has different members, and we need to esteem every member of the body, even those members that we don't normally think of being as so important. We need to recognize the value. I didn't write this, I don't know who did, but the acronym, together everyone accomplishes more. Ecclesiastes 4 says 2 are better than 1. They have good reward for their labors, and a threefold cord is not easily broken. Too many of us have a Rambo. There's a song, how many remember the old song? I think it was Eagles, Desperado. Desperado, all by yourself. You know, there's actually a psychological profile called the Desperado complex. Somebody who thinks he doesn't need anybody else, and therefore doesn't bother getting emotionally involved with other people because he doesn't need them. And that's an unhealthy attitude in men and in women. And then we need to be available. First of all, to be aware, to be appreciative, and then to affirm. And the word affirm means assert strongly and publicly. Buck, where are you at? Can I share what you shared with me after Sunday school? Buck had his family over recently. He's got a remarkable family. They've been in our church several times. And he said, you know, Pastor, instead of praying at our meal the last time we were together at Memorial Day, I think it was, or whenever he told me it was, he said, I just stood up and I went to each one of them and I hugged them and I blessed them. I just laid my hands on them and said something appreciative about them. And he said, you wouldn't believe the impact that had on them. The reality is many of us were never blessed by our fathers. Many of us have never been blessed by another man. In fact, if another man came to us like this, we'd put him on the ground. We're just a little uncomfortable. I'm not naturally a hugger. But I remember a man that I met years ago who was a pastor, and I barely knew him, and he walked right up to me and gave me a full frontal bear hug, and I was as stiff as a board and uncomfortable. And I'm thinking, please let me go, please let me go. But I realized that man was taking a risk in embracing me. And not only did he was a pastor, and I noticed he did that with a lot of people. And I realized, why am I so uncomfortable being touched by another man? One, I'm not that guy, but why am I so uncomfortable with that? And the reality is because I had never been touched appropriately. I wasn't molested, but I'm saying I never had a man in my life touch me. Never, that I can remember, unless it was hit me with something. So the point is, we carry a lot of these things in our lives, and it makes us uncomfortable because we didn't get it. It's a little difficult giving it, but I'm trying to become more of that person because I know I was deprived of some of that as a child. The word affirm is another thing. I wasn't affirmed as a child. And again, I'm not trying to pour out my soul so you can pity me. This is it. I mean, this is true. And neither were many of you, and that's why I say this. And therefore, affirming others is not as what? Natural to us. So it's easy to have I didn't get it, so I'm not going to give it. Well, where do you go to get it if you didn't get it from mom and dad? God says, I will be a father to the fatherless. And God brings people in flesh, angels unaware, that can speak to our lives at any stage of our lives and begin to honor us and affirm us even publicly. Affirm, assert strongly and publicly, offer emotional support and encouragement. Affirmation is basically appreciation that's expressed. The reality. It's modeled like this older couple sitting on the rocking porch, and the man in a very tender moment turns to his wife of 50 years and said, honey, you know, sometimes I appreciate you so much I have to fight not to say it. The reality is some of us are like that. We're afraid to give honest, sincere praise. Affirmation is nothing more complicated than I recognize something that's of value to me and I'm letting you know that it's appreciated. Bible tells us in Romans 12, be kindly affectionate one to another with brotherly love, in honor preferring one another. Romans 13:7 says, render therefore to all their dues, honor to whom honor is due. Don't honor the dishonorable, but when you find something of honor in someone, especially someone on your team, in your circle, then swallow your pride and get in the habit of affirming that. What gets rewarded gets repeated. 1 Corinthians 12 talks about giving the members of the body and the members of the church more abundant honor, even if they're not out there where we notice them. Now, the lack of affirmation, literally, it can produce an emotion, something called emotional deprivation disorder. You guys know I'm a counselor. I'm into psychology, but that's not what I'm talking about. I'm saying if we withhold these things, it does affect the people in our lives to varying degrees. This particular disorder, it's an arrested emotional development. It produces an arrested emotional development, which means it's hard to grow up in a healthy way when you're in a home or in an environment where you're never told, good job, when you do a good job. Problem is, in our society, we're telling people good job when they do a bad job, and it confuses everything. But emotional deprivation disorder, which means it's not easy to grow up emotionally when I don't have positive reinforcement. Insecurity, inferiority, inadequacy. Now, if this is true, if our generationally point men, God can't find point men who will stand in the gap for their own family. Therefore, they're not aware of what's going on in their family. Too busy, too distracted. They're not appreciating the good qualities in their family, and they're not affirming those qualities. I'll use me as an example. I didn't get that stuff, so what if I never gave that stuff to my children? Now, my mom had 6 kids. My dad and my mom had 6 kids. So if we didn't get it, and we didn't get it from someone, somewhere, so I grew up without any of these things. I grew up with an arrested emotional development, insecure and inferior. Now I have 10 kids. Chances are what I'm going to do to what are the chances that I'm going to give my kids something I didn't get?
I thought you had 12.
I have 15 actually, but another story for another time. We lost 5. But you understand, if I didn't get it from anywhere, and I don't give it, now the 6, and multiply that by 6, right? Because I have 5 siblings. I have 10 children. What happens to my kids if I don't ever, I'm not aware, I'm not appreciative, I don't affirm? What will happen to my kids? They'll grow up with these same insecurities and emotional stunted development. And then they get married to some unsuspecting young man or young woman who probably didn't get it either. You understand what I'm talking? Think about the generational. Is it possible that because point men aren't being strong in the grace that is in Christ Jesus, is 2 Timothy 2, that the conditions of the last day described in 2 Timothy chapter 3 are a generational consequence? Lovers of their own selves, covetous, boasters, proud, disobedient to parents, blasphemers, unthankful, unholy, without natural affection, stunted emotional, relational, spiritual growth. Here's my conclusion. Men, it doesn't matter how able you are if you're not available. Doesn't matter how much you know, how much you see, how much you could help, if you're just not available. The word avail means to help, to benefit. We become available by becoming increasingly aware, increasingly appreciative, and increasingly affirming of those God has called us to partner with. Galatians chapter 5 says the flesh lusts against the spirit against the flesh. There's this battle in all of our hearts. It talks about the fruits of the flesh, which are envy, strife, all these terrible things, rotten fruit that is a natural byproduct of being selfish and sinful. Then the fruits of the Spirit, love, joy, peace, long-suffering, gentleness, goodness, faith, meekness, temperance. Then it talks about people getting overwhelmed in faults. We've all done it. We all find ourselves in some nasty pit, Galatians chapter 6. Then it goes on to say those which are spiritual should restore them in a spirit of meekness. Then it says bear one another's burdens, so fulfill the law of Christ. Get involved in each other's life. That's that mentoring process we talked about last week. Then it says, but be not deceived. God is not mocked. Whatever a person sows, he's going to reap. He that sows or plants to his flesh, you feed the flesh and not the spirit, will of the flesh reap corruption. He that soweth to the Spirit, you cultivate the fruits of the Spirit, mentioned in chapter 5, will of the Spirit reap life everlasting. And let us not be weary in well-doing. Don't quit because you don't feel like it. For in due season we shall reap if we faint not. Then it says, as we have therefore opportunity. If you look up opportunity in a Greek dictionary, you'll find, I didn't have room for the long word, but it means there's a season. As you have a season, as you have an opportunity, do good unto all men, but especially to those who are the household of faith. That's talking about the church, and I'm talking about your household. Now here's my point. We won't always have an opportunity. The season will pass. The season to influence, the season to affirm, the season to appreciate, the season to be aware. Remember a child arrived just the other day, came to the world the usual way with planes to catch and bills to pay. He learned to walk while I went cats in a cradle. You older generation know that. The season passes. Linda and I used to sing a song, cherish the moment. Soon they will depart. Cling to the memory. Hold them to your heart. Soon comes the time when you'll have no child to hold. So cherish that moment. The season will pass. Hebrews chapter 5, which is about the family, by the way, and chapter 6 says, see then that you walk circumspectly. That means carefully. Not as fools, but as wise, redeeming the time. Buy it back. I've lost time. You've lost time. We have to sacrifice, rearrange our schedules so that we can become more available to God and to our families. Wherefore, be not unwise, but understanding what the will of the Lord is. We never know how much time we have left. What is your life? God says it's a vapor. Many of you said, I want to become a mentor or I want to be mentored. But you know, if you don't do something about that decision, you'll get distracted, and you'll be the same person or worse today than you are in a year than you are now. We have to make decisions in order to change anything in our lives. We've got to maximize the time that God gives us. We don't know how much of it we have left. Teach us to number our days that we may apply our hearts to wisdom, Psalm said. And quality time cannot be scheduled. It's a spontaneous part of quantity time. You ever have teenagers? You know that they kind of kick into gear at about 11 o'clock at night. You know where my brain is at 11 o'clock at night? I don't know where my brain is at 11 o'clock at night. Quality time can't be scheduled. The Greek word for honor is spelled time. The Bible tells us to honor our parents. Spend time with your parents. The Bible tells husbands, honor your wives. Be available, spend time with them. But the word doesn't really mean time. It means to pay a price. That's what it means, to value. To honor someone. Remember, charity never fails. Charity is benevolent giving, sacrificial. To honor someone is going to cost you something. To honor your family, to be available to your family, to be available to God, to be available to others is going to cost you something. That's how you demonstrate honor. Are you willing to pay the price necessary, men and women, in order to become available to your family? And how about to your God? Remember, it was God who said, I sought for a man. God says, I can fix this mess. I could work even in this dark despair. But I'm looking for someone to work with and work through. But I found none. No one in that era would be available. And you read the rest of the chapter and judgment came. Therefore I have poured out mine indignation upon them. I've consumed them with the fire of my wrath. Their own way have I recompensed upon their heads. That's Galatians 6, right? Sowing and reaping. The last verse in the Old Testament illustrates this generational impact. God talks about the last days and Michael standing up and fighting for the prince of, Michael the prince fighting in the last days and the tribulation period. But he says this, but I will send Elijah the prophet before the coming of the great and dreadful day of the Lord. I know that physically responds to the two witnesses of the book of Revelation, but the reality, God says, before I bring judgment, I will send a messenger. I will send a prophet. I will send someone that will stand in the gap and will try to change the dynamics. I will send Elijah. He shall turn the hearts, don't miss this, of the fathers to the children. And then the hearts of the children to the fathers. Starts with you, Dad. Starts with you. If it doesn't, I will come and smite the earth with a curse. The consequences of not being available will catch up. Will you step up and stand in the gap? Isaiah chapter 6, Isaiah had a vision of God in a very dark season of his life. And he heard God say this, whom shall I send and who will go for us? He said, here am I, send me. Are you willing? Are you willing to spend enough time with God to recognize He's still looking for men and women, by the way, even young people, who are willing to stand in the gap? Because there's people in your life, the sowing and the reaping, they're going to reap what they're sowing. They're going to suffer because of the choices that they're making. And God is saying, I'm looking for an Elijah. I'm looking for someone to come alongside of them, someone to stand in the gap, someone that I could work through to warn and to help them to find my path again. If I can't find someone that will stand in the gap, they will suffer the consequences of their own way. Would you pray with me?